Dr. Mchangizi here with your Science Moment. Recently, after a year of being on Twitter and YouTube, where many of you know me, I decided to go back to Facebook and Instagram, where there's family and acquaintances and friends. And I figured there's no reason for the folks that are in your life to not have any idea that there's this alternative viewpoint than the mainstream narrative that they've been being fed and being propagandized by on CNN and so forth. And so I went back maybe, in May or June, and man, I had folks that literally, it's as if they've never heard that there's another view. They said, Mark, is there something wrong? Would you like to talk about this? I had folks, family members, extended family members, print out my Facebook post, bring it to an aunt who then showed my mom. I mean, so they're printing out Facebook posts. Now, so I think it's important that the people that are in your life that love you, you will annoy them. There's no question. But if we're going to stop this kind of mass hysteria that's been spreading and that has totalitarian smell to it and is sort of violating civil rights from top to bottom for the last year and a half, we have to do it in all places, not just on Twitter and elsewhere. We need to go to Facebook and locally as well. So one of the things that happened when I was on Facebook is an older friend of mine had just asked a question. I replied, and I think this reply gets at the nub of what most of us who are on the anti-lockdown, anti-mask, etc. side on team rationality, what our viewpoint is in a nutshell. So let me quickly just read to you what he wrote to me in my relatively terse, emotional reply. So my friend writes, if you challenge the scientific community, you should have an alternate solution to the problem. Simply throwing your hands in the air doesn't sound like a well-informed argument. What is the solution? Doing nothing isn't one. And my response, first, this isn't Mark against the scientific community. This is one sub-community of scientists who agreed with the narrative the media and politicians were pushing, and those same scientists thereby became the experts in their stories and represented the science. But there's another huge community of scientists worldwide against this since the start. But their story didn't fit the narrative of an altogether novel and dangerous virus that we should do anything and everything, including violating civil rights en masse, in order to stop. I'm associated with several organizations of scientists who've been opposed to this from the start. Just because CNN tells you experts say doesn't mean experts say. It's bullshit. As for where the responsibilities are, for those proposing altogether novel, draconian civil rights quashing interventions, what was required was to provide a cost-benefit analysis, including the obvious potential for devastating side effects. They did no such analysis. Instead, they misapplied the precautionary principle, saying, we have to do something out of precaution. But the precautionary principle is that the burden of evidence is on those proposing the new, untested policy. Lockdowns, mandatory masking, shutdowns, social distancing, etc. were the new, untested policies and were explicitly recommended against as of 2019. They were enacted by panic, copycatting other nations and states, and covering your ass. Not only did they not do the utility calculus on both sides of the equation, they pretended that we live in China, where there are no civil rights. The first two principles of medicine are do no harm and obtain consent. Both were violated. The harms have in fact been massive and obvious. I was shouting against it on social media since March 10th of 2020, along with like-minded colleagues on the left, center, and right. And worse, the interventions have been shown to not even have narrowly worked. Their only effect was the devastating side effects to health, short-term and long-term lockdown deaths, and livelihoods by virtue of crashed economies. The responsibility is not on me to say what else we should have done. Doing nothing would have been dramatically preferable. But there were obvious things to do. The infection fatality rate ranges from 0.0002% for less than 18 years old, which is many times safer than flu, to around 5% or even more for those pushing 80 plus with comorbidities, in which case it's several times worse than the average flu. That's 4 or so orders of magnitude variation. And so there's absolutely no reason to overturn society, because the folks in danger are painfully obvious to find. Focused protection of those individuals was all that was needed. And that was the letter. Now, one thing you may notice is that in this anti-vax letter, which might be painted as, did I mention vaccines? No. The folks that have been against this and that are against vaccine mandates, not against vaccines per se, have been against all of these authoritarian, draconian, narrowly ineffective interventions since the start. And that nicely sums up, I think, most of our opinions on the matter. And that was your science moment.